Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something surprisingly human, something so ordinary, so universal, and yet when you add the word medieval in front of it, suddenly becomes both horrifying and kind of hilarious. Yes, tonight we're going to relax with the topic of how medieval people actually went to the bathroom. Now, before you imagine knights in shining armor striding gallantly into battle or ladies in flowing gowns twirling around candlelit halls, remember, everybody, from the lowliest peasant to the king of France, had to poop. And medieval solutions to that timeless biological fact ranged from vaguely functional to, are you sure that's sanitary? Spoiler, no, it was not. So, dim the lights, snuggle under your blanket, and let's float gently down the foul-smelling stream of history. Let's start at the very bottom, literally, with peasants. If you were living in a medieval village in, say, the 12th century, you probably didn't have a private bathroom. What you had was a chamber pot, if you were lucky, or just the outdoors. A simple clay or wooden pot was the go-to solution. You'd use it in your little hut, maybe behind a screen, maybe just in the corner. And then in the morning, you'd empty it outside, ideally into a designated pit, but often just into the street. This is where medieval villages started smelling like, well, like what they were. Imagine narrow dirt lanes, livestock wandering around, refuse from tanning and brewing, and on top of it all, your neighbor's bucket of yesterday's dinner making its second appearance on the cobblestones. Because sure, medieval Europe wasn't known for its cutting-edge sewage systems. Unless you lived in a fancy city with leftover Roman infrastructure, sanitation was more like a community suggestion than a real plan. In London, for example, people were literally fined for dumping chamber pots into the street, which tells you that dumping chamber pots into the street was, in fact, the default. And of course, medieval people didn't just stop smelling it. They were nose-blind to a degree that you and I probably can't even comprehend. When you live surrounded by pig dung, tanning vats, open sewage, and a communal sense that soap is optional, you stop noticing. For them, the smell of the Middle Ages was just Tuesday.
Now, let's float up a little higher, into castles, because surely the nobility had better options, right? Well, yes and no. Castles had what were called garde-robes, which is a fancy medieval word for a little stone closet with a hole in the floor. You'd sit down, do your business, and gravity would take care of the rest. Where did it go? Straight down the side of the castle wall, or into a pit at the base of the tower, which naturally turned into a giant open-air cesspool. And yes, if you're wondering, the word wardrobe actually comes from the same place, because garde-robes were also used to store clothes. Why? Because the ammonia smell from the waste supposedly killed moths. Which is very medieval logic. My underwear smells like a cesspit, but at least it's moth-free. Now, of course, castle garde-robes had a few problems. First, they weren't exactly secure. Enemy soldiers could crawl up through the muck-filled shafts to sneak into the castle. That's right, you could literally have an army attack you through your toilet. This happened often enough that it became a known military tactic, which is honestly one of the worst ways to get captured in history. Imagine the shame. You're trying to surprise the enemy, and instead you die crawling up a latrine chute. Not exactly knightly glory. And the second problem was just hygiene. If you had a big garrison living in a castle, and they all used the same garde-robe, the waste pits filled up fast. They had to be shoveled out by hand, usually by the lowest-ranked servants. Which means somebody's actual medieval job title was latrine digger. And if you think your job is bad, just remember you could have been that guy. Now, not all castles were so primitive. Some of the grander ones had surprisingly advanced systems. For example, certain 13th century castles in England had multi-seated communal latrines complete with running water channels underneath to carry things away. Which sounds impressive until you remember that the water often just carried it downstream to the nearest river, which was also your drinking supply. So, progress, I guess. Speaking of rivers, that was another popular solution. If your house, monastery, or castle was near one, your toilet simply emptied straight into it. Which is great unless you happen to live downstream. In medieval Paris, the Seine was not just a river. It was the entire city's waste management system. People bathed in it, drank from it, and yes, dumped into it. A full-service experience. But let's drift over to the monasteries for a moment, because monks, with their strict routines, had a very particular relationship with bathrooms. In many monasteries, the latrines were built in a row, often with stone seats lined up side by side. No partitions, no privacy, just a long bench of silent monks doing their business together in brotherly solidarity, which is an image. The idea was that even bathroom time should be communal and regulated. Some monasteries even rang bells at set times so that all the monks would file into the latrine together like the world's least glamorous choir. And monks, of course, also doubled as some of the earliest sewer engineers. At the great Cistercian abbeys, they designed water channels to flush the latrines, which was pretty advanced compared to the rest of medieval Europe. So while your average peasant was still dumping a bucket out the window, monks were living in the medieval version of a flush toilet paradise.
And since we've mentioned windows, yes, people absolutely dumped waste out of them. In many cities, it was completely normal to just fling the contents of your chamber pot into the street below, often yelling a warning first. In France, the traditional cry was "Gare de l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." Except it wasn't really water, and if you didn't move fast enough, well, you learned quickly. This practice was so widespread that certain cities had official night soil collectors, people who went around with carts scraping human waste off the streets.
Again, if you're having a rough day at your office job, just take comfort in knowing you could have been medieval Paris's designated poop collector. Now, we can't talk about medieval toilets without mentioning the royal experience, because kings and queens, as always, had to do everything a little more extravagantly. Take the English monarchy. At the royal palaces, the king had an official servant known as the groom of the stool. Yes, that was the actual title. His entire job was to help the king with his bathroom business, which included fetching water, managing linen cloths, and occasionally, if you believe certain accounts, assisting more directly. It was one of the most intimate, trusted positions at court. The groom literally knew the king inside and out. And here's the kicker. Far from being humiliating, this was considered a prestigious post, because being in charge of the king's toilet meant you had constant private access to him. You could whisper advice while he was, let's say, in a reflective mood. Many grooms of the stool went on to become powerful political figures. So yes, in the Tudor court, cleaning up after the king was basically a stepping stone to power. Let's pause here and take a gentle breath. Because while all of this sounds absurd, it's also deeply human. Medieval people may have had different technology, different customs, and wildly different standards of hygiene, but the basic reality was the same. Nature calls, and you have to answer, whether you're a peasant with a chamber pot, a monk on a stone bench, or Henry VIII with his royal groom of the stool. And now that we've dipped our toes into this slightly murky subject, let's drift further into the weird little details, because we've only just begun.
So we've covered the where. But of course, bathroom questions don't stop at location. There's also the matter of what happens after, which brings us to the delicate question of liping. Or, as medieval sources often put it, cleansing one's fundament. Because apparently, even in the 13th century, people enjoyed dressing up basic bodily functions in fancy vocabulary. Now, you may be thinking, surely medieval Europe had some clever, standard solution. And the answer is, not really. Options varied wildly depending on where you lived, how wealthy you were, and how much you cared about your backside. For peasants, the go-to materials were whatever happened to be handy. Straw, grass, leaves, moss, clumps of hay. In some cases, a scrap of cloth that could be rinsed and reused, which, yes, is exactly as gross as it sounds. And if you're picturing a freezing January morning in northern England, crouching outside with a fistful of frozen straw, well, congratulations, you've captured the authentic medieval experience. For those living near water, smooth river stones were also an option. In fact, stones are one of the oldest forms of toilet paper known to humanity, and medieval people were no exception. They even turn up in archaeological digs, sometimes with suspicious wear patterns. A very glamorous find for the archaeologists tasked with cataloging it. And then, of course, there were the rich. Because if you had money, you weren't about to scrape yourself with straw. Wealthy households sometimes used scraps of linen or wool cloth, and in particularly luxurious courts, soft wool or even imported fabrics could be reserved for the royal posterior. Which makes you wonder how many exotic silks ended their life cycle in such an unglamorous way. But by far the most common toilet paper substitute across medieval Europe was water. In many places, people simply rinsed with a jug of water or with running streams built into the latrine, which is honestly more effective and hygienic than straw. In fact, this practice is still common in much of the world today, and medieval Europeans were not unfamiliar with it. So in a sense, we've just come full circle with the modern bidet.
Now, wiping aside, we should talk about another major aspect of medieval bathroom culture, the bathhouse. Yes, people in the Middle Ages did bathe. Not as often as you or I probably would, but certainly more than the cliché of the filthy medieval peasant suggests. And bathhouses weren't just for washing. They were also social hubs, business meeting spots, and, of course, toilets. Picture this.
You walk into a public bathhouse in a medieval city. There are big wooden tubs or stone pools, steam rising, people lounging, chatting, sometimes eating and drinking while soaking. And tucked discreetly off to the side, little latrine cubicles where you could relieve yourself before hopping back in. Because nothing says relaxation like a quick trip to the communal toilet followed by a dip in the warm bath water with your neighbors. Bathhouses, especially in places like Germany, were semi-co-ed for much of the Middle Ages, which adds another layer of awkwardness to the whole bathroom situation. Imagine sitting in a hot tub with your coworkers, knowing that the bathroom facilities are essentially 2 doors away and shared by everyone. It was a different sense of personal boundaries. And of course, bathhouses had a reputation. In some cities, they doubled as brothels, or at least as places where things got less than holy, which is why certain moralists spent centuries complaining about them. But as for their toilets, they were often simple wooden benches over running drains, flushed by streams diverted from nearby rivers. Which sounds practical until you remember where those rivers ended up. Now, let's float gently to another angle. How did gender affect bathroom habits? For men, things were relatively simple. In the street, in the fields, behind a tree, men had options. Medieval cities were filled with little public urinals, often nothing more than stone troughs against a wall. These were called piss pots or piss stones, a kind of proto-public restroom, though not particularly discreet. Men could walk up, do their business, and move on, while everyone else politely pretended not to notice. For women, things were less convenient. Privacy was harder to come by, especially in crowded towns. Women tended to rely more heavily on chamber pots indoors. And when traveling, they sometimes carried small personal pots hidden under skirts. Archaeologists have actually found these traveling chamber pots in surprisingly delicate ceramic designs, decorated with flowers or even witty inscriptions. Because if you're going to haul your bathroom around under your dress, you might as well make it fashionable. And then, of course, there were pregnancy and childbirth, which added another layer of bathroom complication. Medieval medical texts are filled with advice for easing constipation, bladder problems, or difficult humors related to women's digestion. Doctors often prescribed herbal remedies like fennel, parsley, or even ground-up stones. Don't try that one at home. And midwives kept a whole arsenal of tricks for helping with post-birth bathroom problems. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical.
Now, speaking of medicine, we need to wander into the world of medieval digestive theory. Because, of course, medieval doctors had opinions about waste. In the grand system of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, digestion and excretion were central. A healthy person was supposed to purge waste regularly, balancing the humors and keeping the body in order. Too much constipation? Clearly an excess of cold, dry humors. Too much diarrhea? That's hot, wet humors running rampant. Either way, medieval doctors loved prescribing enemas. And not just a casual enema. We're talking elaborate contraptions involving leather tubes, animal bladders, and herbal mixtures. Recipes survive that include ingredients like chamomile, dill, honey, and even wine, which is basically a medieval spa treatment, except it was being pumped into your rear end. Royal courts took this very seriously. King Louis XIV of France, yes, the Sun King, though a bit later than our medieval focus, is said to have had over 2,000 enemas during his reign. That's about 1 a week for most of his life. He considered it essential to his health and dignity. And while that's technically outside the medieval timeline, it shows how deeply these ideas stuck around. So the bathroom wasn't just about necessity. It was part of a whole medical worldview, where health, morality, and bodily functions were tangled together in one messy package. Another quirky detail, medieval latrines often doubled as trash pits. People threw everything down there. food scraps, broken pottery, old shoes, and yes, sometimes even documents. Which is why archaeologists love medieval toilets. They're like time capsules, perfectly preserving the debris of daily life. Entire household inventories have been reconstructed from cesspits. One dig in London turned up everything from oyster shells to leather gloves to a child's toy horse, all mixed in with the obvious. And then there's the social aspect. Using the bathroom wasn't always a private affair. In monasteries, as we mentioned, monks went together. In castles, garderobes might have multiple seats side by side. Even peasants working in the fields weren't exactly sneaking off behind bushes with total discretion. In some ways, bathroom time was just another part of communal living. Privacy, as we think of it today, simply wasn't a high priority. Let's not forget about smells, because medieval writers definitely didn't. Chroniclers loved to complain about the stench of cities, especially in summer. In London, the Thames was so polluted by the 14th century that people described it as a stinking flood. Paris had laws against tanners and butchers dumping waste, but enforcement was, let's say, optimistic. Even the great cathedrals weren't immune. Records survive of latrines overflowing near holy sites and priests writing complaints about the odor wafting into church. And yet, people lived with it. They even developed a sort of dark humor about it. There are medieval poems making jokes about chamber pots, comic plays about farting monks, and marginal doodles in manuscripts of people squatting over latrines. Clearly, medieval scribes got bored and decided to decorate holy texts with toilet humor. Proof that humans have always been, well, human. So, as we drift to the end of this part, let's take a gentle step back. We've talked about wiping with straw, communal monk toilets, fashionable travel chamber pots, enemas with wine, and archaeological cesspits. It's a lot to digest, pun intended. But more than the gross details, what's striking is just how normal all this was. Medieval people weren't shocked by any of it. They accepted their bathroom world as part of daily life, just as we accept toilet paper, plumbing, and air freshener as part of ours. The real difference is not in the biology, that hasn't changed, but in the technology and the cultural expectations around it. And in some strange way, that makes the Middle Ages feel closer. Because when you strip away the castles, the cathedrals, the crowns, and the crusades, you're left with people. People trying to deal with the same daily necessities as us, with whatever tools and ideas they happen to have.
Let's start with buildings. When you walk into a medieval castle or tower, one of the odd little features you'll often see is a tiny side chamber, sometimes sticking out of the wall, sometimes tucked into a corner, with a narrow shaft leading down. That's not a closet. That's a toilet. Castle architects had to think about where to put garderobes, because, inconveniently, human waste follows gravity. The trick was to build them on outer walls, so the shaft could drop outside the castle rather than straight into the Great Hall. In some cases, garderobes were built into little stone projections called murder holes or dung chutes, which basically made the castle look like it had tiny balconies of doom. And this wasn't just a European thing. Across the medieval Islamic world, palaces also had latrine chambers carefully designed with water channels, sometimes even decorated with tiles. Because apparently, if you're gonna go, you might as well do it surrounded by nice mosaics. But castles weren't the only structures shaped by toilets. Cities themselves had to plan around waste. Some towns dug big public cesspits where chamber pots could be emptied. These pits were periodically cleaned out by teams of gong farmers. Yes, that was the actual job title in England, and their work was both vital and absolutely disgusting. A good gong farmer could make decent money,
but at the cost of wading waist-deep into medieval sewage at night. Not exactly a dream career path. And here's where things get unhealthy. Cesspits, while convenient, were also perfect breeding grounds for disease. They leaked into the soil, contaminated wells, and generally made medieval cities giant petri dishes. During the Black Death in the 14th century, people noticed that crowded, smelly neighborhoods seemed to suffer the most. Of course, their explanation was miasma, bad air rising from filth, which wasn't entirely wrong. The filth really was connected to disease, just not in the way they imagined. Ironically, some of the wealthiest households were at special risk because they had bigger garderobes and more waste pits. A small peasant hut might have one bucket to empty, while a grand townhouse could have multiple indoor latrines draining into a single festering cesspool beneath the floor. Imagine living above that in July. Even if you survived the smell, the bacteria were quietly plotting your downfall. And yet, despite all this, sanitation reform moved at a snail's pace. People complained constantly about the stench of cities, about cesspits overflowing, about rivers turning into liquid garbage, but effective sewage systems remained rare until much later. The Romans had cracked this puzzle centuries earlier, but medieval Europe largely shrugged and lived with it. Now let's glide over to something more entertaining: bathroom folklore. Because of course medieval people had superstitions about waste. In some cultures, it was believed that witches could use human excrement to curse you, which meant you had to be careful where you dumped it. There are also scattered references to love charms involving, well, let's just say unorthodox ingredients from the latrine, because nothing says romance like potion recipes involving chamber pot leftovers. Even the devil was sometimes imagined lurking in toilets. Medieval manuscripts occasionally depict demons crawling up from cesspits or hiding in privies, ready to grab the unwary. Which makes sense. If you're sitting alone in a dark, drafty stone shaft at midnight, strange noises echoing around you, it's easy to start imagining supernatural company. Personally, I'd be more worried about rats. But sure, demons. And let's not forget humor. Fart jokes were everywhere. From Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to marginal doodles of monks mooning each other, medieval writers clearly found endless joy in bathroom comedy, which tells us that some aspects of humanity truly never change.
But perhaps the most fascinating details are the bathroom-related accidents of the elite, because yes, even kings and nobles managed to get into trouble while answering nature's call. Take King Edmund Ironside of England in the early 11th century. According to some sources, he was assassinated while on the toilet. The story goes that he excused himself during a feast, went to relieve himself, and an enemy hiding in the latrine stabbed him from below, which has to be one of the least dignified royal exits in history. Or consider King George II of Britain, a bit after the medieval period but still worth mentioning, who famously died on the toilet of an aortic aneurysm. Contemporary accounts describe him collapsing while straining. Not exactly the grand image he probably wanted for posterity. Closer to the medieval era, we have Martin Luther, the Reformation leader, who reportedly did much of his theological thinking while on the privy. He claimed that some of his insights came to him during long, uncomfortable bathroom sessions, which means entire branches of modern Christianity might trace back to medieval constipation. Even popes weren't immune to bathroom drama. Pope John XXI was killed when the ceiling of his study collapsed, a study he had built right next to his private latrine. The cause? Poor construction, weakened by moisture, which is a very polite way of saying the Pope died because of a badly placed bathroom. Now, stepping away from the royal accidents, let's zoom back to ordinary life and the way bathrooms shaped social etiquette. In many medieval towns, there were rules about when and where you could dump your chamber pot. Some cities required people to wait until after dark to minimize daytime splashing accidents. Others required a shout of warning before tossing waste into the street. In Bruges, for example, records survive of people dumping without calling, which suggests plenty of victims walked under the wrong window at the wrong moment. And if you were renting a room in a medieval inn, the bathroom situation was often even worse. Many inns had shared outdoor latrines or none at all. Travelers often carried their own chamber pots or simply made do with corners of the stable, which makes you think twice about the romantic notion of medieval taverns. Behind the ale and the roaring fire was probably a very smelly corner.
Another overlooked detail? Medieval toilets were dangerous. Garderobe shafts were steep and slippery, and there are actual records of people falling in. Sometimes children, sometimes drunk adults, occasionally even servants who lost their footing while cleaning. Falling into a cesspit was not just disgusting, it could be fatal. The fumes alone could suffocate you. Chroniclers describe cesspit drownings with a mix of horror and dark amusement, as though they couldn't quite believe anyone could die in such a ridiculous way. One of the more infamous cases is that of George, Duke of Clarence, in 1478. Officially, he was executed for treason, but according to rumor, he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. A few wags suggested that maybe it wasn't wine at all. Maybe the butt in question was more literal, which is probably unfair slander, but it shows how gleefully medieval gossip linked death and bathrooms. Let's drift back to the home, though, because while all of this might sound grim, for most people, the bathroom was just another chore. Empty the pot, sweep the floor, try not to step in anything. For peasants, dealing with waste was part of managing animals, gardens, and compost. Human waste was sometimes even used as fertilizer, mixed carefully with other refuse, which is resourceful, if not exactly appetizing. And the rhythms of daily life made it ordinary. In towns, everyone knew the night soil carts would come around. In castles, servants trudged with buckets. In monasteries, bells rang for bathroom breaks. It was all woven into the fabric of existence. So as we close this part, let's step back again and admire the bigger picture. Toilets, cesspits, garderobes, and chamber pots may seem like unglamorous footnotes to history, but they literally shaped the world medieval people lived in. They influenced architecture, public health, social customs, even politics. The groom of the stool had the ear of the king. The gong farmer kept cities from collapsing under their own waste. And somewhere in the middle of it all, ordinary people went about their business, quite literally. It's not shiny or heroic, but it's real. And it's human. And maybe that's the best bedtime story of all.
Let's begin with archaeology. If you ever wonder how historians know so much about medieval daily life, about what people ate, what they wore, even what they feared, the answer often comes from the least glamorous of places, the cesspit. See, latrines weren't just used for waste. They were also the medieval equivalent of a trash can. If something broke, you tossed it in. If food scraps were left over, down the hole they went. And since cesspits were damp, sealed off, and often airless, they accidentally became perfect preservation chambers. In London alone, archaeologists have uncovered cesspits containing everything from oyster shells to leather shoes, pins, toys, combs, and fragments of clothing. In one case, a medieval dice set turned up at the bottom of a latrine, probably dropped during a game, or maybe tossed in during a fit of righteous anger over cheating. Imagine losing your favorite dice to the privy and having to explain that to your gambling buddies. And then there's the food evidence. Seeds from figs, grapes, strawberries, and even exotic spices have all been found in medieval toilets, which tells us that diets were far more varied than the stereotype of endless gruel. Richer households especially were flushing away reminders of their trade connections: saffron, peppercorns, cloves. A global economy summarized in the sludge at the bottom of a hole. Of course, cesspits also preserved less glamorous items: parasite eggs, for instance, roundworm, whipworm, tapeworm, which lets modern scientists measure just how infested medieval intestines were. Spoiler, very. If you ever needed proof that medieval people weren't living in hygienic bliss, the parasite count makes it undeniable. But let's leave the archaeologists happily sifting their cess and talk about another group who had to deal with bathroom logistics: pilgrims and travelers. Imagine you're in the 13th century, walking across Europe on your way to Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury. You've got blisters, a staff, maybe a little bag of bread, and suddenly nature calls. Where do you go? The answer was usually wherever you could: roadsides, bushes, ditches. Pilgrim hostels sometimes had crude latrines, but with dozens of travelers crammed together, you can imagine the state of them. Records survive of innkeepers being fined for not maintaining their privies, which suggests that most travelers encountered more smell than comfort. On ships, things were even worse. Medieval boats often had a simple wooden platform at the bow or stern with a hole over the water. Sailors used it in full view of the sea, and each other, which is where we get the nautical term the head, still used today to mean toilet. Privacy wasn't exactly part of the deal. If the weather was bad, well, let's just say bathroom arrangements became everyone's problem. And if you were traveling with a noble entourage, you might bring along a portable toilet, essentially a fancy box with a chamber pot inside, sometimes padded with cushions. Think of it as the medieval version of a VIP porta-potty. Kings and queens did not lower themselves to roadside squats. Their servants carried the chamber, emptied it, and set it up again wherever needed, which meant the royal bottom never had to touch anything rustic.
Now, shifting from travel back to towns, we should talk about the law. Because yes, medieval bathroom habits were regulated. Cities passed endless ordinances about waste disposal. In Paris, people were forbidden from emptying chamber pots during daylight hours. In London, residents were fined for letting their cesspits overflow into neighbors' yards. Bruges had inspectors who checked the depth of latrines to ensure they weren't contaminating wells, which is both impressive and faintly ridiculous. Imagine a medieval official whose job description was privy depth measurer. Punishments could be surprisingly strict. One case from medieval Germany records a man being fined heavily for dumping waste into a public fountain, which honestly seems fair. Nobody wants to drink from the city's decorative sewage cocktail. But even with laws, enforcement was patchy. Complaints about smells and filth fill the record century after century. Clearly, people kept breaking the rules, which tells us that medieval sanitation officer was probably the least respected job on the payroll. Now let's wander into a more unusual corner: bathroom accidents as political weapons. In 1183, during a siege at Acre, chroniclers record that defenders dumped latrine waste onto attackers as a kind of chemical warfare. Buckets of filth rained down on enemy soldiers trying to climb ladders, which is disgusting, yes, but also brutally effective. Medieval siege accounts are full of such tactics: boiling water, hot oil, rocks, and occasionally chamber pot contents. War was not a clean business. Even in peacetime, toilets could spark disputes. Landlords and tenants argued constantly over who was responsible for emptying cesspits. Neighbors sued each other for damage caused by overflowing privies. There are records of entire court cases centered around one family accusing another of letting their waste leak into the cellar next door, which is not exactly the glamorous kind of medieval drama we like to imagine, but it's probably far closer to reality. Now, as we begin to drift toward the Renaissance,
bathroom culture starts to shift. Slowly, very slowly, people began thinking about sanitation in broader terms. By the 15th century, cities like Nuremberg and Bruges were experimenting with more organized waste disposal systems. Public latrines were built in market squares, sometimes even with attendants who collected small fees. Wealthy households invested in private cesspits lined with stone to keep the smell in and the neighbors happy. And by the late Middle Ages, there are even references to early versions of flushing toilets, simple contraptions using water to wash away waste. Still, change was gradual. Most people, most of the time, kept right on using chamber pots and garter robes. It would take centuries more and a few devastating plagues before sanitation became a serious public priority. But the seeds were there. Or more accurately, the seeds, bones, and broken toys preserved in cesspits were there. Let's pause here with one last thought. Medieval bathroom life was messy, smelly, and often unhealthy, but it was also deeply ordinary. The people who lived it didn't write grand chronicles about their toilets. Well, not usually. They just got on with it, which is why so much of what we know comes not from glittering manuscripts, but from the archaeology of waste. And maybe that's a fitting reminder. History isn't just kings and battles. It's the small, daily, unglamorous details, like a chamber pot in the corner, a gong farmer at midnight, or a monk sitting shoulder to shoulder with his brethren in the cloister latrine. The story of humanity told one flush, or non-flush, at a time.
All right, friends, we've been on quite a ride, from the stony benches of monastery latrines to the dignified chamber pots of kings, to the unfortunate gong farmers in the pits below. We've trudged through archaeology, parasites, legal disputes, and even the occasional medieval toilet war tactic. You might think there's nothing left to say, but history, like a bottomless privy, always seems to have more layers. So for this final stretch, let's drift into the lighter corners of medieval bathroom culture. Things people laughed about, prayed about, or tried desperately to ignore. Let's start with religion. Yes, even toilets had their saints. Take Saint Vincent Ferrer, a 14th century Dominican preacher. He was so thorough in his sermons about daily life that chroniclers claimed he once warned people about the dangers of relieving themselves carelessly near sacred spaces. It's not exactly fire and brimstone stuff, but it shows how spiritual guidance sometimes extended all the way to the privy. Then there's Saint Fiacre. He wasn't exactly a toilet saint, but he got tangled up in bathroom history anyway. In the 17th century, a public house in Paris dedicated to Saint Fiacre became known for hiring out horse-drawn carriages. People would ask for a carriage from Saint Fiacre's, which got shortened to fiacre. Fast forward, and eventually in French slang, a fiacre was also a polite word for the toilet. So indirectly, Saint Fiacre became a kind of bathroom mascot. Not quite what he signed up for. And yes, monasteries had prayers for nearly everything, including entering and leaving the latrine. The idea was that no moment of life was too humble to connect with God. Which is admirable, if a little awkward to imagine. A row of monks quietly chanting as they sit shoulder to shoulder, not exactly the heavenly choir one expects. Now, shifting from saints to humor, because if there's one thing universal across history, it's that people have always found bathroom jokes funny. Medieval literature is sprinkled with scatological humor. Chaucer, for instance, in the Canterbury Tales, couldn't resist. In The Miller's Tale, there's a whole scene involving a character sticking his backside out a window and another kissing it by mistake in the dark. High art, apparently. Another favorite came from the Fabliaux, short comic tales popular in France. Many included jokes about chamber pots being spilled on people, or tricksters using privies as hiding places. If you thought toilet humor was a modern low point, rest assured, medieval audiences were already giggling centuries ago. And then there's the famous marginalia, those doodles in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. Amid the saints and angels, you sometimes find little figures squatting, mooning, or otherwise caught mid-bathroom activity. Proof that even the most serious monk with a quill occasionally got bored and resorted to doodling butts in the holy text. Humanity is consistent.
Now, let's take one last wander through daily life. What did all of this actually feel like for the average person? For a peasant in a village, it was probably simple. You went outside, maybe to a shared pit, maybe just behind the house. No privacy, no ceremony. Life was too busy for fuss. For a merchant in a bustling town, things were trickier. You had to balance convenience with law. Chamber pot in the bedroom, yes, but empty it wrong and you risked fines. People probably developed rhythms. Dump at dawn, clean the pot before neighbors noticed. For a noble, bathroom life was strangely luxurious, yet dependent. The royal body never touched filth. Servants handled the chamber, servants carried the waste, servants aired out the cushions. Which sounds pleasant until you realize how little privacy was involved. Kings had attendants called grooms of the stool, men of noble birth whose entire career revolved around assisting the king during bathroom time. It was considered an honor. Imagine explaining that at family dinners. Yes, I attend His Majesty, very personally. And for monks, it was about rhythm and community. Bells tolled, psalms chanted, benches shared. Even waste disposal was part of the sacred order of the day. Strange, but oddly peaceful. Now, before we drift toward the end, let's glance ahead, toward what eventually changed all this. The Renaissance didn't sweep away chamber pots, but it did bring more interest in engineering. Architects began designing castles and palaces with slightly better waste systems. Chutes lined the stone, cesspits dug deeper, sometimes even rudimentary water channels. The 16th century saw Sir John Harington, godson of Queen Elizabeth I, invent a flushing toilet for himself. The Queen tried it once and never used it again. She didn't trust the pipes. Fair enough. But still, the idea lingered. Over centuries, that experiment turned into something more practical. By the 18th and 19th centuries, with sewers finally being built, the flush toilet became the norm. A revolution in daily life. Medieval people would have been astonished, maybe even skeptical, at the thought of water whisking everything away. And that's perhaps the biggest shift. For them, waste was something you lived alongside. The smell, the inconvenience, the occasional danger, it was part of the fabric of life. For us, it's hidden. Pipes, plumbing, porcelain. We rarely think about it. Unless, of course, the system fails. Then suddenly we understand exactly what medieval Londoners felt when their neighbor's cesspit leaked through the wall. So here we are. We've wandered through garderobes and pits, walked beside pilgrims on the road, listened to monks chanting in the latrine, peeked at saints and jokes, and finally drifted toward the first flush. It's been a long journey, but a strangely human one. Because in the end, this subject, as silly as it seems, is universal. Everyone, everywhere across all time periods, has had to answer nature's call. Kings, peasants, monks, sailors, children. The details change, the cushions, the pits, the pipes, but the reality doesn't. And that's maybe why it's oddly comforting. History can feel distant, but bathroom history reminds us people then were not so different from us now, just slightly smellier. So, as we close, take a breath. Let the details of chamber pots and cesspits fade into the background. Picture instead a quiet medieval night, a castle lit by torches, a village settling down, a monastery cloistered, humming with soft prayers. Somewhere, a gong farmer sighs and lowers a bucket into a pit. Somewhere else, a queen rings a little bell for her chamber pot to be carried away. And somewhere, a child sneaks outside to the bushes, laughing at the stars. Life in all its messy glory going on. And that, friends, is the end of our long wander through medieval bathrooms. Thanks for staying with me. May your bed be soft, your night be quiet, and your plumbing modern. Sleep well.